guys, thanks for tuning into Unlimited Hangout. I'm your host, Whitney Webb. If you are familiar with my work on the Jeffrey Epstein scandal, you are likely aware of at least aspects of the sordid history regarding the involvement of intelligence agencies, including the CIA, in child trafficking and sexual abuse. However, in my currently published work on Epstein, I wasn't able to cover every historical instance of the intelligence community's involvement in these dark activities, having only touched on well-documented abuse cases like the Franklin scandal and some lesser-known incidents that directly related to the same network of individuals or groups that Epstein later inhabited. But there is another related scandal that definitely deserves our attention, as it involves ties of the CIA to a nefarious cult that sexually and ritually abused young children, a horrific group that has historically gotten little media attention, with reporting on the incident in recent decades being almost entirely restricted to independent media. This cult, known as the Finders, briefly entered the national spotlight in the late 1980s and early 1990s, around the same time that the Franklin scandal and other intelligence agency-linked scandals of a different nature, such as Iran-Contra and the Promise Software scandal, were in the process of being quote-unquote investigated and covered up by U.S. government agencies. Years after the story was memory holed by the media and the Finders' ties to the government had been covered up by federal investigators, documents were released a few years ago in 2019 that have allowed some journalists to piece together more of the story than ever before. One of them, Elizabeth Voss, joins me today to discuss her recent series at Mint Press News on the Finders and their intelligence ties. Elizabeth is an independent journalist who has done considerable work on whistleblowers, intelligence agencies, and the Julian Assange case. She is currently a contributor to Mint Press News and has had her work published in several outlets, including Consortium News, where she co-hosts their See and Live program, and has published some great work there on intelligence-linked human trafficking scandals like the Dutroux affair. She has recently published the third installment of a deep dive into the Finders cult, putting together pieces of evidence that others have missed and that paints a truly horrific picture of what U.S. intelligence agencies have been capable of doing after decades upon decades of no accountability for their crimes and violations of both U.S. and international law. So thanks for joining me today, Elizabeth. Happy to have you on the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So to start off, reading some of these documents about the Finders case that you include in your pieces, I actually found really sickening, and that's coming from someone who has written about awful crimes, including pedophilia, sexual abuse, the Epstein case, things like that for some time now. And I was really struck by not only how freaky and disturbing some of the things found at Finders properties were, but also the age of the children involved, because we're talking about children much, much younger than those who were involved in the Epstein case here. So it was honestly, surprisingly for me, hard to stomach, but I think that's also why the story is so important, particularly given the fact that the U.S. government had some obvious involvement here. So first off, I felt like I needed to say that to let that serve as a warning for those listening to this episode that may potentially find this topic difficult to listen to, because it may not be for everyone. But with that being said, it makes sense, I think, to first introduce the events that led the story to break out into the mainstream media, at least back in the late 80s, meaning the arrest of two men affiliated with the Finders cult in Tallahassee, Florida in 1987. So could you please give an overview of those men, that arrest, the court case that followed, and how the Finders were treated by the media at the time?
Absolutely. Yeah. So basically on February 4th, 1987, you had an individual call the Tallahassee Police Department because they had witnessed some about six children acting very unusual. They looked very dirty, unkempt, and one record said they were acting like animals. And they were in the company of two men who were very well dressed at the same time. They were living out of a blue van. And so the caller basically was concerned about whether or not these were, children with their parents and that type of thing. So they called the police in Tallahassee. The police responded. And the two men, as you mentioned, Douglas Ammerman and Michael Holwell, or Houlihan, depending on which name he was using at the time, gave very evasive responses. They initially said that they were taking the children to Mexico to a school for brilliant children, and the police found this very unusual. They didn't trust them. They suspected that they could be trafficking these children and maybe have kidnapped them. So they arrested them. Houlihan apparently dropped on the ground and pretended to faint and refused to answer any questions. And so initially, the Tallahassee Police Department, looked at this as a potentially interstate trafficking incident. So they called around to various agencies in various states. They eventually identified that the men were part of the cult known as the Finders, based out of Washington, D.C. And initially in the investigation, from what I can tell, Tallahassee police did a really great job at trying to really look into this. They had, doctors who appraised the children as having been sexually abused. There doesn't seem to have been interference in that investigation in the first few days. But that only lasted for approximately a week, because after the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police Department became involved, there was basically this shift from, looking at the cult as potentially abusing children, and also the allegations that came out around ritual abuse, which were widely reported in the press initially by, all of the papers of note that you would imagine: the New York Times, the Washington Post, national headlines, cult ritually abusing children, satanic abuse, all of these types of things. And it was, really sensational. And that isn't to say that there wasn't an element of truth to that, but they really heightened those allegations at the expense of others. But about a week later, the DC police started to downplay all of those cult allegations. They started reframing the Finders as a misunderstood hippie commune that were simply an alternative lifestyle community. And eventually, due to lack of evidence, the initial charges of child abuse against the two men were dropped, because essentially they had been transporting these 6 children from DC with the consent of their mothers, who were Finders members. And it took a little while for the authorities to establish that these were children of the Finders members. And basically, they didn't even look at any sort of prosecution for neglect. They didn't look at a whole lot of other things. The allegations of sexual abuse against these children that were recovered was walked back by other authorities, like state authorities in Florida. And so relatively rapidly, you have basically this reversal of the official narrative. And so basically, the charges eventually were dropped against the two men by about March of '87. So within, a month, they were out, they were fine, and no one was ever prosecuted in relation to this case. There were Finders properties in DC and in Virginia that were searched, and that's where U.S. Customs Agent, Special Agent Ramon Martinez comes into the story. He participated in the searches of both the Finders' houses in DC and the warehouse that they had, and his reports basically blow the official narrative apart, which we can get to a little later. But there were the evidence that they found, and this is included in the FBI vault documents, which basically, in my opinion, attempt to bolster the official narrative. The stuff that's included versus the stuff that's redacted tends to be along the lines of, well, we never saw this evidence, or we never were interfered with by the CIA. But nonetheless, they admit in those documents that the evidence was gone, and that the descriptions of evidence were never found, and that even the records of the records basically were unusual. Like there were things that were not signed that should have been signed, all sorts of stuff like that. So because of Martinez's account, which he wrote in two customs memos that were later published by Ted Gunderson and some other people, that because of that, and because those customs documents made their way to some Congress people, there was a lot of pressure building up by 1993 to have the case looked into, because there were allegations of the CIA interfering. There were allegations that obvious criminal activity by the Finders had not been prosecuted or investigated properly. And so you have in late 1993, a Department of Justice inquiry is launched. But the interesting thing about that is that when you actually look at the vault documents, you see that the DOJ says in news reports at the time, okay, we've got a special task force. We're going to look at this. We're going to get down to what happened. And of course, in reality, what the documents reflect is the DOJ passing the investigation off to the FBI headquarters, and the FBI headquarters then passing that off to the Washington Metro Field Office. And the Washington Metro Field Office is the one that's compiling all the documents, writing the synopses, communicating with the FBI director, and that type of thing. Meanwhile, they're the same agency that was working with the MPD in the initial '87 investigation. So it's not a neutral party. And it's also a party which Martinez said in his customs records had been basically kept in the dark as well. The evidence was not sent to them originally. So instead of it being this Department of Justice, special task force that's going to overview and have a real check and balance on these other agencies, you have agencies that were initially involved investigating themselves in their own investigation. So, but so unsurprisingly, you have the official narrative coming from that inquiry being that there was no evidence found that the CIA interfered in the Finders investigation in 87, and that there was no evidence of criminal activity found ever on the part of the Finders, which is a direct refutation of the main allegations made by Ramon Martinez, which was he saw evidence of severe, really serious criminal activity on the part of the Finders, and that the CIA then stepped in and rendered it an internal matter, and that labeled the reports regarding the investigation secret, and prevented the evidence from being reviewed by anyone.
All right, so let's drill down on the CIA ties a bit. So in your most recent piece, you go over several key pieces of evidence that link the Finders to the CIA. So given their involvement in the investigation and their decision to declare this an internal matter, obviously that points to something, right? So if you wouldn't mind laying out some of the other compelling pieces of evidence that you noted regarding CIA ties to the Finders, particularly the, I believe it's pronounced PD family, the apparent involvement of the CIA as the, quote, owners of the Finders, and also one of their funding sources, if there was any other involvement regarding not just the CIA, but other federal agencies in covering up the true extent of the Finders' crimes.
Sure. Yeah. No, and first of all, just to give that context again about how serious this would be, if you had the Finders conducting the type of, activities that Martinez says he witnessed, and that was then protected by the CIA, if that was allowed to become the public narrative, you would have a United States agency arm of government basically protecting some of the worst crimes imaginable, really. So it would be very much in the interest not only of the Central Intelligence Agency, but also other government agencies for that type of embarrassment to be avoided,
right,
if it were true. So that's the beginning context. But the evidence for CIA involvement with the Finders has a couple of different elements to it. And as you mentioned, that's kind of broken down in my latest article. The first is the relationship between the founder of the Finders cult, Marion Petty. I just pronounce his name Petty. I'm not entirely sure if that's correct, but he claimed that his son had worked for the CIA Front Air America, which I know that you covered very extensively in terms of its relationship later as Southern Air Transport with Jeffrey Epstein and Leslie Wexner, which I found really interesting. But basically, you have Petty himself claiming that his son worked for them. You also have the FBI vault documents admitting that Marion Petty's wife, Isabel, worked for the CIA for 21 years, from 51 to 70, from 50 to 71. And that's interesting. In a couple of documents, they seem to write it as 61, and I'm not sure exactly why. But the most authoritative reports I could find were that she worked until 71. They admit this is the vault documents. This isn't Martinez's allegations. They admit that she was given passports to restricted countries that could only have, basically the travel to which could only have been facilitated by something like the CIA or the State Department, like, in the height of the Cold War. So you have North Korea, the USSR at the time, and North Vietnam during the Vietnam War. And the documents attempt to portray Isabel as a staff stenographer and basically call her an employee, so rather than like an agent or something like that. But it seems that very improbable that a simple staff stenographer would be going over to North Vietnam during the North Vietnam War and stuff like that. So
right.
That's really interesting. The other thing is that in some of these reports referring to those passports, you have the name of the person receiving the passport redacted, whereas in everywhere else throughout these documents, Isabel's name is not redacted because she had died long before any of these investigations took place. The other thing about that makes it interesting to me is that you have these passports being found in the Finders DC properties in 87, and you have them described by Martinez, which, again, basically suggests that he's being accurate in the evidence that he's describing, because then we have the same passports being described by Sergeant Stitcher and others in these documents. And I'll get into Stitcher in a minute because he's really interesting and a key figure in all this. But you have so again, you have this admission that Isabel was given these passports, but it appears to me that there's a possibility that these passports were also being given to other Finders members, and it's unclear as to how many, because the name is redacted. But it suggests that that may have been somebody other than Isabel that was also traveling on these passports. But the fact that you have the Finders founder, his wife admitted to having worked for the CIA for that length of time and traveling to those kinds of countries. That in itself it speaks for itself. It's very damning. It's a very concrete direct link between the CIA and the Finders cult. You also have other links, as I mentioned, that relate to Marion Petty himself, and that is that he worked for the military for approximately 20 years, I believe, starting in the 1930s. He was in the Army initially, but he basically worked in the corps that became the Air Force. So after that point, he was working for the Air Force. And in the earliest days of his career, he admitted in court testimony that he was opening these open apartments, like an open house style situation, where he was letting people come in with no fees asked, no questions asked, and he just wanted to have an open house, learning about money, sex, and power from people that would come in. And again, this is in DC. And basically that was involved with the earliest days of what would become kind of the hippie movement, the New Age, what would then be called the alternative lifestyle community. And so what that says to me, and I think that it's a really important thing to note, is that Marion Petty did not simply retire in the 50s or so and become a hippie. He didn't just have a lifestyle, like a sea change in his life. He was working in the military actively while developing connections in the New Age hippie sphere, or what would become the hippie sphere later on. And so that says to me that his work in the military very likely could have related to that work in the New Age. The other thing that's really interesting is the parallel between Petty's work in that sense and the activities of people that were later associated with the CIA's MKUltra program, like Dr. Louis Joy Long West, who was infamous for his role in the whole MKUltra program. And he, like Petty, he opened an open house in Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco, and he labeled it, he framed it as a hippie crash pad, and he had funding from the CIA to study people that came into this place. Again, in the same sense, with no questions asked, free food, just hang out here, crash here, do drugs here, whatever. And they're going to study, the effect of these drugs on these hippies. So you also later on, not just in the early days of Petty's activities, but later on when the Finders group is fully functional, it's fully formed, and it's very active, they have a rural property in Virginia called the Ragged Mountain Ranch, and they again were offering basically free housing, very low cost, and no questions asked to people. So you have this continuing kind of parallel there. And in addition, and this branches off a little bit, but basically in terms of the Finders group itself and relationship to intelligence or parallels with intelligence, we have testimony from Lieutenant Hart from Culpeper, Virginia, I believe of Virginia State Police, who said that basically he had contact with the Finders cult, and that he thought that Petty would take a military plane to China. And then you have another person in law enforcement saying, from, I believe, again, Virginia State Police, saying that the Finders had attempted to take control of the local Culpeper city government in Culpeper, Virginia. So, and that's really interesting because Sidney Gottlieb, who's known as basically the black sorcerer of MKUltra, and that's mainstream media coming up with that term, basically retired. When he retired to Culpeper, Virginia as well. And not only that, he retired under that same kind of guise as this environmentally conscious eco-hippie. He was raising goats and eating yogurt and that type of thing when he was interviewed. And, while that on the surface, it just sounds like a way to rehabilitate his highly tarnished image, It's a very interesting parallel with the Finders and their whole their framing of themselves as hippies, very alternative and all of that. And it's very interesting that they would try to take over, according to state police, the city government of the same town that Gottlieb would eventually retire in. So I thought that was very interesting. Then you have, and all of this, there are some researchers who have said something to the effect of, well, the Finders love to lie and they love to play games with people's heads. And so basically they would love you to think that they're CIA. They would love you to think that because it would make, basically stoke Petty's ego or something to that effect. And that would be all well and good if it weren't for the CIA connections with the 1987 investigation and what appears to be the ultimate cover-up of that interference by the CIA in the 1993 inquiry. So in 87, you have Martinez writing, again, as we've mentioned, that the CIA stepped in and ended the investigation into the Finders cult. And you have and this is where I'd like to bring in Sergeant John Stitcher, who's really important in terms of the CIA connection with the Finders, specifically in the 87 aspect of it. Martinez's initial customs documents are redacted in terms of who told him that the CIA had stepped in. He describes them as a third party speaking off the record, because at the time that Martinez wrote those reports, Stitcher was still alive. However, by May 1992, Stitcher passes away due to what is called septic shock in his obituary. And so subsequent documents do not redact his name for that reason. And we have Martinez's whistleblower complaint that specifically states that Sergeant John Stitcher was the individual at the Metropolitan Police Department who informed him that the CIA had stepped in, that they had rendered the whole investigation an internal matter, et cetera, et cetera. So Stitcher is also the person who reached out to the CIA from Metropolitan Police Intelligence Division and asked them, what's going on. And he's the person who writes the report that admits that Isabel Petty had been given these passports, that the CIA seems to have had, quote, a vested interest in the Finders, that they may have been funding them. And so, it's very unfortunate that the one person who could have corroborated Martinez's account and who could have corroborated the CIA ties and admission of ties with the Finders happens to have passed away about a year before this DOJ inquiry takes place, so that no questions of him can be asked. So you've got that. And then the 1993 inquiry basically comes along, tries to refute Martinez and tries to, state in various places that people, didn't experience. People from various agencies will state in the FBI vault documents on this 1993 inquiry, saying, to the effect, well, the CIA didn't interfere directly with my investigation, or I didn't see the evidence that Martinez says he saw. However, and we can, get more into that, the admissions in the vault documents actually contradict those people. So.
All right. So since you've mentioned, Raymond Martinez several times, are there any more of his claims that you want to go into? Because there's a few specific ones that I want to ask you about specifically. So I think it would be best to let you give an overview, not just of his claims, but also of which pieces or which assertions of his are corroborated by other evidence, some of which you already mentioned, and also your overall assessment of his credibility over the course of your work on this case.
Sure. Yeah, I've been looking at Martinez's. I've looked into his documents since about 2017. I reached out to him in 2017, and I did speak with him for about an hour, but it was off the record and he refused to go on record. And at the time, obviously, these vault documents had not been published. That happened later in 2019. So by the time I reached out to him again to speak with him, he was refusing to talk to me even off record. So he's really unwilling at this time to speak to anyone, it seems, about this case. And I don't really blame him. It seems that from the interview and the communication that has been published between Martinez and Derek Burrows of the Conscious Resistance, it seems that Martinez feels that he believes there will be no prosecution of this case, therefore why talk about it? And to an extent I understand that, but my point there being that Martinez is hardly, coming out of this case looking for attention, to put it mildly. But he did confirm to me that his documents were real, that the ones that, are published online are genuine, that he authored them, et cetera, et cetera. Martinez was a special agent for the Customs Service at the time of the initial 1987 investigation. He had been associated with the child pornography unit, which, eventually, I guess, was shut down. But for that reason, he was asked by Agent Kreitlau, who was from Tallahassee, was from the Tallahassee Customs Service, to basically look into the databases and see whether the Michael Houlihan or Douglas Ammerman came up in the child pornography databases. That was negative, but Raymond happened to be in DC at the time, and he was contacted by another agent who had contact with Kreitlau, who asked him to basically participate in these searches. So Martinez goes into these searches, the first of which takes place at the houses, the residences of the finders in DC, the day after the initial arrests. So you would think that there would be, whatever evidence to be found would be there. That is a little bit murky because it's indicated, and it's kind of a long story, but it's indicated that the finders were already by the end of the end of the day on the 4th, they were already aware of the arrest. They were already communicating about it. And that's not just from Martinez's accounts. That's also from records from the Tallahassee Police Department. So Martinez goes to the residence in D.C. on the 5th, and he alleges that he sees, and this isn't in the article because it was just so long already, but I'll go into it now because I think it is important. And that is that he sees a man named Stuart Silverstone in the finder's residence. And he records his social security number. He describes him as sitting amongst all of these documents. Now, that's if we were to think that Martinez was inventing the documents that he witnessed or the description of them, it's really fascinating that he would happen to, just magically meet the person who turns out, as far as the Tallahassee Police Department records go, was from the very earliest moments of the case calling them, making anonymous phone calls under a different name, and very interested in what was going on with the children in Florida. So he's a known finders member who is corroborated to have existed by other police department records and all of that. So in this room that Martinez describes as a documents room, he sees evidence of communications across an early version of kind of like a computer network amongst the finders between locations in the other parts of the country and overseas. And he has a really, stoic way of describing what he's seeing. He doesn't try to say, okay, well, I'm seeing evidence that they're obtaining children for XY purposes. He just says, this is the evidence I'm seeing. And I introduced that because later on in some Metropolitan Police Department documents and reports, you have really weird kind of analysis of the psychology of the group. So I just wanted to establish there that Martinez does not kind of go into speculation in his report. He simply describes what he sees. So he says that he sees documents referring to the finder's desire to obtain children. He says it's for unspecified purposes, but they seem to be very, very interested and motivated in obtaining children, and sometimes criminally, but sometimes not through criminal means, for example, through the impregnation of finders' members to produce children, but also through trading, kidnapping, purchasing, and whatever other method they can go with. He says that he sees communications requesting the purchase of two children from Hong Kong through the contacts in the Chinese embassy. China comes up a lot in this case and in various documents across the board, which again kind of corroborates Martinez, because why on earth would it be China of all places when you have China coming up all the time with the finders? He also describes the finders researching private families that are not finders members, looking into occupation at daycare centers, as babysitters, basically compiling intelligence on families. And he does not speculate that they're going to go in and kidnap children, but that's the implication from what he says. And before I continue with what he saw, I'll just add that that was partially corroborated by another vault document that says that the Washington Washington Metropolitan Police Department basically had to speak to a woman because her information had been contained in Finder's documents, and they had attempted to, gain employment from her as a babysitter. And so the police were basically alerting this woman that her information had been found in Finder's documents. So again, I add that because it corroborates what Martinez is saying.
Right. So on that case in particular, I wanted to mention that because that particular woman you're talking about had been referred to Finders members as babysitters by employees of Georgetown University, and you have mentioned MK Ultra several times, but what I found interesting about Georgetown coming up is that not only does that school have longstanding ties to the CIA just in general, but the CIA on record used it for various parts of its MK Ultra program. So I definitely found that a little disturbing, to say the least. Anyway, continue.
No, that's a really great point. And I mean, again, like the articles, the two articles that have really gotten into the deep dive aspect of the case were like 4,300 words by the time they were published. So I didn't want to go into too many tangents, but you mentioned that. And there was also, if you read the Martinez documents entirely, and not just rely on my summaries of them, there's also an interesting point where he says that there is a resident in the Finder's property that was a Chinese citizen who was going to Georgetown University and studying anatomy as well. So Georgetown comes up again there also. But moving back to what Martinez said that he witnessed, he also saw the basically what he described as files that were labeled as operations, which is not a term that a hippie lifestyle commune is going to describe its games as. I think basically we can establish that the way that the Finders framed their activities as games is very much just a lame attempt to disguise what is obviously intelligence type operations. They labeled their files operations. They had things titled like terrorism, explosives, Pentagon break-in, and a lot of other things. Like they had file names that were referring to countries where they had operations, which included one file labeled Palestinian, and there were high tech transfers of money, a lot of money from London, from the UK. So you've got indications of child kidnap, trafficking, purchasing, trading. You have indications of money being transferred internationally. You have indications of some sort of interest in terrorism, in breaking into the Pentagon. I mean, it's very explosive.
Mental.
It's not the type of allegations that would be made lightly. But the way that Martinez describes it is not at all, sensationalized. He's just like, these are the names that I remember. This is what I saw. So he goes through, and then on the second day, in his participation in the search warrants, he's at the Finder's warehouse, which is a second property. And in that property, he's shown photographs that include the infamous, what was called a ritual abusive event, with these children being participating in the slaughter and disembowelment of two goats, a male and female goat, one of which the female was pregnant, and so they have issues, the kids participating in her disembowelment. You have Finders members dressed in white robes standing around the children doing that. The Finders' explanation for that incident and the photographs of it is that it was a keepsake from a learning moment, a teaching moment that was intended to basically teach them about anatomy or to, about the reality of meat and how it's produced and that type of thing. So interesting, like that's really, really confronting. The issue that I think is brought up is, and one of the ways that people have dismissed this whole story is, well, it was a moral panic, it was satanic panic. People ran away with that picture, and therefore, the whole case is bunk if we don't believe that that's a ritually abusive situation that was happening. And the thing is that regardless of what you think the intent was behind those images, they were documented by multiple other police departments, by the news reports at the time, et cetera, et cetera. So Martinez was not, inventing having witnessed these images or what they contained. The only debate that there is exactly what was intended with that activity. You also have, nude images of children. And Martinez doesn't actually state this himself in his documents, but news reporters who got a tip-off to the search of the warehouse on the second day, which was the 6th, basically said, that they witnessed from the bags of photos and bags of documents that were being taken out by police from this warehouse, that they saw an image through through the clear plastic bag of a child, a naked child in chains. So,
oh my God. Okay.
so it's like, yeah, no, I mean, it's like that. And then this evidence that was then collected that was extreme. I mean, and that Martinez attempts to review for a month is then what disappears. And then the records of it don't have any description of or detailed description of what the evidence was. It just describes it as photographs, documents, passports. It doesn't say where the passports are to. It doesn't say what the photographs are of. So the search warrant, which is the only record there is in the vault documents, one of them doesn't even have somebody who's signing it as a witness in the way that you're supposed to. And the WMFO had to admit that was improper in their own synopsis of the whole thing. And so, as I said in the article, it would be really easy to dismiss what Martinez is saying if they had records of evidence, if they had copies of the evidence. But instead, the evidence is destroyed and or returned to the finders within days. And then we don't have the records of it even to go on after that. So that leaves us relying on Martinez's word and also on the word of John Stitcher, who, as I said earlier, passed away before we could, have corroboration from him. So getting back to what Martinez saw, in addition to the documents that he saw and the photographs that he saw in these two locations, on the second day, he was in the warehouse and he describes the whole setup there as basically like, he describes it as there were rooms that looked like they were for indoctrination, or some type of altar setup with jars of urine and feces, many of them being around this altar-y type situation. Other police department records from the DC police corroborate this. They don't specify the way that Martinez does about the urine and feces and that type of thing, but they say that there are rooms roped off that look like sets, which suggests pornography, basically. And so their take on it was more pornographic. They also throughout various documents from various agencies, you have this reference to mind control that comes up a lot. Martinez says that there looks to be a room that looks like it's set up for, quote, indoctrination. And you have other police basically corroborating that, saying that it looked like there was a room that was used for some type of mind control. There were books that expressed an interest in mind control. And there was, satellite dish antennas set up on the roof. There was all sorts of technological, advanced kind of technology there. Martinez says that they looked like they were set up to create their own videos and send them out. So that's what you have at the warehouse the second day. And again, all of the evidence, as I said, was disappeared before Martinez himself could review it or anyone else could review it. And basically, what you have is the entire official narrative resting on Martinez's word being a lie. Because if he is credible, you have all of this evidence of obviously criminal activity that was never investigated,
right,
that was never prosecuted. If he's credible, you have an indication that the CIA stepped in to protect this group, and according to Stitcher, the CIA essentially was running this group, or at least was probably funding them, had a vested interest in them. And we know that the Finders Cult founder and his wife was working for the CIA for 20 plus years. So if Martinez is correct, if Stitcher is correct, then that is a huge problem. And so basically what happened was the evidence was disappeared in the use of the term that way. And it leaves us with only Martinez's word and no way to verify it. The other issue with this whole story is that none of the children as adults that were recovered in Tallahassee have come forward as adult victims. They haven't given their stories to the public. So, and there is a number of other issues like that set this case kind of apart from issues like Dutroux, where you do have multiple witnesses who came forward as adults saying, this happened to me, or Epstein. You have lots of victims, witnesses saying, this is what I saw, this is what I experienced. So what we're left with is the documentation from Martinez, the documentation from these vault documents, and the statements of people associated with the case, the Tallahassee police records. For those reasons, I can understand why this case has received so little attention, much less the association with ritual abuse, which has become, basically radioactive to most journalists. So,
right.
for multiple reasons, it's very understandable that most journalists wouldn't want to cover this. However, the strength of Martinez's record, I think, is real. I think I would assess him as very credible based on the corroboration of details in his reports, like the disembowelment of these goats, like the babysitter situation that relates to Georgetown, and the fact that he documented Stuart Silverstone being at the location, like that. Those aspects of what he's saying are corroborated elsewhere. The only thing that we can't corroborate directly are unfortunately, the most damning allegations about these documents seeking the obtaining of children and kidnapping and that type of thing.
Right. So one thing I do want to comment on what you just said is about like why none of these children as adults came forward. And so I think what sets these children apart from those involved that were victims of the Dutroux affair or the Epstein scandal is that their parents were part of the finders, whereas with Epstein victims, with Dutroux victims, their parents weren't in on it in the vast majority of cases. Maybe one exception with the Epsteins would be like the Dubins. There's like weird claims that Epstein wanted to marry their daughter, but the parents were very close with Epstein and all of this. And there's been some speculation about that, but just speculation. So I think that may be one of the reasons why. And one thing I did want to ask you to clarify on, mainly for people who are listening, is exactly what age of children we're talking about here, because there's also not just the fact of the age of the children who were discovered in Tallahassee, but also the presence of clothes and articles for children of specific ages at these properties. So could you elaborate a little bit on that, please?
Absolutely, yeah. The children that were recovered in Tallahassee range from approximately 2 years old to 6 years old. Most of them were unable to communicate. They were mute. And just to expand on that a little bit, they didn't seem to know how, toilets used. They defecated and urinated on the floor. They were exceptionally hungry when they were found. And so they were clearly not in good shape. The fact that the finders were not prosecuted for just issues of neglect boggles my mind to this day, regardless of any of the other allegations that you have in this case. What Martinez describes is a plethora of children's clothing aged from toddlerhood, infancy to preschool that he witnessed at these finders' residences in DC. And I should also add, because I meant to say this earlier, that the communications that Martinez says he witnessed included instructions from the finders in DC, from basically describing telling other finders members to move the children, and how to, the children being children, obviously, that were not the ones that had been recovered in Tallahassee.
Right.
These were additional children of an unknown number that they were basically saying that you need to move them. Here's how to avoid law enforcement, keep them going through different jurisdictions. And none of those children were ever found. We don't know how many they had. It's completely unknown. But like as you mentioned, from what Martinez says, they must have been very young. And I agree with you that it is a very different situation when you have finders members having these children and having them grow up from birth in this situation. It's a very different thing than having 14-year-old girls being lured into this by somebody like Ghislaine Maxwell when you talk about Epstein and his situation.
Yeah, I think there are some differences here for sure. And also, with Epstein, a lot of those women, as far as we know, right, the victims that have come forward were lured in. Whereas what we're talking about here are things like kidnapping, purchasing, and stuff like that. And there is evidence that Epstein did that to an extent, but one of the most credible cases of Epstein purchasing someone, for example, that woman who was purchased from a family in Eastern Europe, ended up becoming a co-conspirator and part of his entourage, became part of the system. Right. So I think, the ways in which these victims are brought into these circles tends to have an impact on how they view the situation to a certain extent, and whether or not they feel, Stockholm syndrome or things like that, get factored in. So there's a lot of different things to consider. And of course, the massive age difference here in both the Dutroux affair in the Epstein scandal, like you mentioned, it was mostly like young teen girls, not very, very young kids that we're dealing with here. And so in the case of like extreme abuse of a 2-year-old or something, an adult in that situation that lived through that may not exactly have the ability to come forward with a complete coherent story about what he or she experienced in this situation, which may be another factor as well. But it's certainly
Exactly.
extremely disturbing, considering the what I would consider very obvious government ties here, because the abuse of children this young in these ways, based on what has been described at these properties, is just like beyond. And I honestly found some of what you described in your pieces honestly like difficult to get through, because I have a kid in that age range, and I just like I can't even fathom this happening to children of that age. But anyway, not to dwell on that and my personal emotional reaction to this stuff, but there are some different things that I wanted to ask you about that you touched on. So one of the aspects of the case that really jumped out to me was this involvement, the fact that it was just international in scope, that there were indications of finders' properties, not just in the United States, not just the ones that were searched, but in other countries, that finders were communicating with people that appeared to be operatives working directly with the finders in other countries. And as you mentioned earlier, the apparent involvement of foreign governments, specifically Hong Kong, with aspects of finders' activities, specifically the acquisition of children. So, as you point out, or as you have pointed out, it's hard to believe the so-called official stories about the finders, considering the extensive international nature of this in ways that do not imply it to have been an alternative living community by any means, especially considering the fact that the HQ of this whole operation was based in DC, the seat of U.S. political power in the national security state, and run by a CIA adjacent leader. And one thing you mentioned in your piece about the founder of the Finders cult that I don't think we quite touched on, is that later on a spokesman for the group admits that he appears to have some sort of military intelligence tie, not just military tie, that claiming that he was trained in intelligence work, but this is a guy defending the group, right? So he asserts that Petty didn't actually engage in intelligence work, but the fact that he was trained in techniques of espionage by the military, I think, is pretty significant in that sense too. So there's one thing I want to say about the Air America connection in relation to Hong Kong, but I can do that later. So if you wouldn't mind speaking to this foreign angle a little bit more, and what you feel its implications are.
Sure. No, it's a great point. And yeah, the interview you referenced with Toby Terrell, who emerged during the 1987 investigation as